Kevin is standing in a jewelry store on a Tuesday afternoon, trying to look calm while doing math he did not prepare for. The salesperson, kind, practiced, not pushy exactly, just gently says the thing. A lot of guys go with the 2 months salary guideline. Kevin nods like this is a real rule, like it's written down somewhere. Official, like skipping it would mean something about how much he loves her. He does the math in his head. It's a bigger number than he expected. Here's the part nobody tells you standing in that store. The 2 months salary rule isn't a tradition. It isn't etiquette. It isn't even old. It's an advertising slogan, invented by a single diamond company in the 1930s that quietly became something an entire culture now treats as a fact of life. This isn't a video telling you not to buy a ring or not to spend real money on one. It's a video about a trap, one so well disguised that we've started calling it romantic tradition. Let me show you the math. My name is Alex, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time looking at where people's money quietly vanishes to. If you've ever heard 2 months salary and just accepted it as a real rule, hit subscribe, because today on Wealth Adjacent, we're taking apart the single most successful piece of advertising copy in the history of consumer spending. Before we go further, a quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, and I am absolutely not telling anyone not to buy a beautiful ring for someone they love. Rings can be wonderful. What I am here to do is run the actual numbers on a rule that gets treated with the seriousness of a law when it was written by a copywriter trying to sell more diamonds. Let's introduce someone. Kevin, late 20s, works in sales himself, actually, which makes what happened to him a little funnier in hindsight. He's not reckless with money. He'd been saving steadily for over a year, specifically for this. He is, in every other part of his financial life, a careful, deliberate person. And then he walked into a jewelry store and let a decades-old ad campaign do his budgeting for him. Let's start with the number, because it is genuinely a little unhinged. In the early 1930s, a struggling diamond company facing collapsing sales during the Great Depression launched a marketing campaign suggesting men spend 1 month's salary on an engagement ring. By the 1980s, that same company's advertising had quietly doubled the number. 2 months salary, repeated in print ads, television, commercials, and eventually in jewelry stores everywhere, with no input from etiquette experts, no historical basis, no connection to any actual tradition. Let me say that again. The number wasn't handed down through generations. It was written, adjusted, and doubled by a single company's marketing department. And it worked so well that most people today assume it's simply how things have always been done. Before this campaign, diamond engagement rings weren't even close to standard. In the years leading up to the campaign, only about 1 in 10 first-time brides received a diamond ring at all. By the end of the century, that number had climbed to roughly 8 in 10. The campaign didn't just invent a spending guideline. It invented the entire expectation the guideline was attached to. And here's the part that should make you sit up. This isn't a story about one clever ad. It's a story about how remarkably well a completely made-up number can disguise itself as tradition if it's repeated with enough confidence for enough decades by enough people who also think it's real. Nobody in that jewelry store is lying to you. The salesperson genuinely believes it's a helpful guideline. Your friends who mention it genuinely think it's a real thing. That's what makes manufactured traditions so effective. Eventually, nobody remembers it was manufactured at all. But an expensive ring isn't the trap. A ring is just a ring. Here's where it becomes a trap. A significant share of recently engaged people report feeling pressure to hit a specific spending benchmark for their ring. And a majority of those people say the number they were aiming for wasn't something they researched or decided on themselves. It was just what you're supposed to do. And the genuinely uncomfortable stat sitting right next to it. A notable share of people who financed part of an engagement ring purchase say they were still paying it off more than a year later, sometimes right up until the wedding itself. Read that twice. People are starting a marriage still making payments on the symbol that was supposed to represent starting it. Back to Kevin. He ends up spending close to $9,000 on the ring, more than double what he'd originally budgeted before that conversation with the salesperson. About half of it came from savings. The rest went on a store financing plan at an interest rate he didn't fully register until the second statement arrived. He told himself it was fine, because that's what you do. That's the number. That's what shows you're serious. He never actually asked where the number came from. Almost nobody does. He is not the exception. Most people shopping for an engagement ring report anchoring their budget to some version of the salary-based guideline, even when directly asked and told the actual origin of the rule. Most still say it felt right to spend close to it anyway. There's also a resale reality nobody mentions in the store, which makes the anchor even stranger once you know it. A diamond purchased at full retail price typically resells for a small fraction of what was paid, often somewhere in the range of 20 to 40%, the moment it changes hands again. That's not a market failure. It's simply the retail markup becoming visible the instant the item leaves the original showroom. Almost nobody actually experiences this directly, because almost nobody resells an engagement ring, which is precisely the outcome the original Forever branding was designed to produce. The ring was never supposed to be evaluated as an asset. It was supposed to be permanently removed from the market, which conveniently also means the inflated price never gets tested again. Now here's the part that turns this from a spending problem into a psychology problem. And this is the part that should genuinely fascinate you once you see it clearly. Behavioral economists call this anchoring, the tendency for an arbitrary number, once introduced, to quietly become the reference point every subsequent decision gets measured against, even when the person doing the measuring knows, intellectually, that the number has no real basis. You can be told, directly, in the same conversation, that 2 months' salary was invented by an ad agency and still walk out having spent close to it anyway, because the anchor doesn't need to be true to work. It just needs to be present in your head at the moment you're deciding. A researcher studying this exact effect found something almost too honest. Once a specific number is introduced into a negotiation or purchase decision, even a number the person is explicitly told is meaningless. Their final decision still shifts measurably closer to that number than it would have with no anchor at all. You didn't decide $9,000 felt right because you calculated it. You decided it felt right because a number had already been planted in your head before you'd thought about it at all. And then there's the specific mechanism that makes this particular anchor so sticky. Most purchases get compared against something, other prices, other options, past experience. An engagement ring is one of the rare purchases most people make exactly once, with no personal reference point of their own. Which means whatever number gets suggested first has almost no competition for the position of the number. There's no personal history to push back against it. Now, before we go further, we still haven't gotten to the version of this trap that's actively getting worse, not better, the one social media has quietly turned into a second, even more aggressive salary benchmark machine. Hold that thought, because first, the smaller leaks. Let's talk about the phrase that should trigger alarm bells the moment you hear it in a jewelry store. Most guys go with. That phrase carries zero actual data. Nobody showing you that phrase has run a survey. It's simply a sentence engineered to make an arbitrary suggestion sound like a documented norm. And it works because in the moment, nobody wants to be the exception to a most guys statement about how much they love someone. Then there's the carrot size as commitment trap, an unspoken scale where a larger stone gets treated as a larger declaration of love, entirely disconnected from the actual quality, craftsmanship, or meaning of the piece. Diamond size and relationship commitment have exactly zero measured correlation in any research on relationship satisfaction, but the visual comparison is powerful precisely because it's instantly readable at a glance across a room in a way that a couple's actual relationship health obviously isn't. There's a social media version of this pattern that's specifically intensified in recent years. Ring reveal posts, side-by-side comparison content, entire online spaces built around evaluating and ranking other people's engagement rings by size and perceived cost. Multiple surveys on wedding spending find a meaningful share of recently engaged people specifically say seeing other people's ring photos online increased what they felt they needed to spend. creating a benchmark that's not just invented once by an ad campaign decades ago, but continuously reinvented and reinflated in real time by strangers on the internet. And then, the version of this trap that's actively getting worse. Online communities specifically dedicated to judging engagement rings, sometimes explicitly mocking rings perceived as too small or too cheap. Research on social comparison finds that visible, rankable purchases produce measurably more anxiety and overspending than private ones, and an engagement ring, worn daily, photographed constantly, is about as visible and rankable as a purchase gets. It's worth knowing the same company didn't stop at one country either. When the campaign expanded into Japan starting in the 1960s, diamond engagement rings barely existed there at all, tied into a completely different set of traditional wedding customs. Within a couple of decades, the same marketing playbook had made diamond rings the expected norm there too, except the suggested benchmark was set even higher, 3 months' salary instead of 2. Calibrated specifically to that market's higher household savings rates. The exact same manufactured number, adjusted per country like a pricing strategy, because that's precisely what it was. If the tradition were actually a tradition, it wouldn't have a different price tag, depending on which market's advertising team wrote the copy. There's also a quieter shift happening in the industry right now that's worth naming, because it undercuts the anchor further. Lab-grown diamonds, chemically identical to mined ones, indistinguishable without specialized equipment, now regularly sell for a fraction of the price of a comparable mined stone. The same 2 months' salary logic, applied honestly today, would mean spending far less than it used to, simply because the underlying product got cheaper to produce responsibly. Nobody's marketing department is in a hurry to update the guideline downward, for obvious reasons. Alright, here's the section nobody in the jewelry industry wants anywhere near a calculator. Let's do this through Kevin, because abstract numbers slide right off the brain. Say instead of $9,000, Kevin had spent $4,000, still a genuinely beautiful ring, chosen because he and his partner actually liked it rather than because of what number it hit, and invested the remaining $5,000 in a simple index fund earning a conservative 8%. Left alone for 20 years, that $5,000 becomes roughly $23,000, untouched, no extra contributions, just left alone to compound while an entire marriage happened around it. That's not slightly smaller ring money. That's meaningfully changes what your first house down payment looks like money. Here's the framework I want you to carry around. Whatever number gets suggested to you for a ring, salary-based or otherwise, ask where that specific number actually came from before you accept it as a real constraint. If the honest answer is an ad campaign, or what I saw online, or what the salesperson mentioned, that's not a rule. That's an anchor someone else planted, and you're allowed to ignore it entirely. And now here's where it gets almost cruel. If more expensive rings reliably predicted stronger, longer marriages, you could at least defend the anchor. They don't. Research comparing engagement ring cost against long-term relationship satisfaction and marriage duration finds no meaningful positive relationship, and some studies have found a mild negative one, likely tangled up with the financial stress that an overextended ring purchase introduces right at the start of a shared financial life. The ring that costs twice as much doesn't predict a marriage that lasts twice as long. It just predicts a bigger bill arriving at the exact moment two people are trying to build trust around money. Now, let me keep my promise, because I am not telling anyone to buy the cheapest ring available or treat this as a purely financial transaction. I can already hear the objections, because I get them every time I make a video like this. First, but it should still feel special. This is a real milestone, meaning matters here. Fair point, and genuinely correct. Nobody's suggesting the ring shouldn't matter. But notice the hidden assumption in that objection, that meaning and price are the same axis, that spending more automatically produces more meaning. A ring chosen because you both actually love it carries more genuine meaning than one chosen to hit an arbitrary number you never actually agreed with. Second, but her friends will ask about it, there's real social pressure here, that's not nothing. Also fair, and also worth saying directly, That pressure is real, but it's other people's manufactured benchmark showing up as your problem. And the actual fix is a 5-second conversation with your partner about what you both genuinely want, not a bigger loan. The actual answer was never spend as little as possible to prove a point. It's spend an amount you actually chose, instead of a number that was chosen for you decades before you ever walked into that store. There's a third objection worth naming honestly too. But a bigger ring genuinely does make her happy. Isn't that worth something regardless of where the number came from? That's a fair and completely different question, and the research on this is actually clear. The boost in happiness from a nicer ring shows the same fade-out pattern seen with almost every other status purchase. Real in the moment, gone within weeks, while the financial obligation it created doesn't fade out at all. The temporary spike isn't nothing, but it's also not what most people think they're buying when they stretch the budget. So here's the framework I'd actually use. I call it the origin test, and you can run it on any spending benchmark in under 10 seconds. Before accepting a rule about how much something should cost, ask one question. Who benefits if I believe this number is true? If the honest answer is the company selling you the thing, that's not a rule. That's a sales strategy wearing a rule's clothing. A few practical moves fall out of that. Set a budget together, as a couple, before ever setting foot in a store, based on your actual finances, not a percentage of anyone's salary. Consider a lab-grown or vintage stone, which routinely costs a fraction of a comparable mined diamond, with no meaningful difference visible to anyone who isn't a gemologist with a loupe. And if a salesperson mentions any version of most people spend, ask them directly for the actual source of that number. Watch how quickly the sentence falls apart. So here's where we land. The engagement ring trap isn't a story about anyone being irresponsible or unromantic. It's a story about a single brilliantly effective sentence from 1930s advertising copy that somehow outlived the company's original intent and turned into something we now call tradition. The data doesn't say rings don't matter. What it does say is something quieter and far more useful. A ring chosen deliberately, funded honestly, and never measured against a manufactured benchmark predicts exactly the same amount of love as one that cost 3 times more, because the number was never actually measuring love in the first place. And if you're Kevin right now, standing in that store doing the same uncomfortable math, hear this clearly. You're not unromantic, and you're not bad with money. You walked into a room specifically designed, for nearly a century, to make an invented number feel like an unbreakable rule. Of course it worked on you a little. It was designed to. Seeing it clearly is most of the battle. So Kevin, next time around, for the eventual upgrade or the anniversary piece, sits down with his partner first, picks a number based on what actually makes sense for them, and treats any guideline mentioned in a store as exactly what it is, a suggestion from the person selling the ring, not a law handed down from anywhere real. Spend on the ring you actually chose. Skip the number that was invented to sell more diamonds during a depression a century ago. And invest the difference, because 20 years from now, that difference is a down payment, or a genuinely different starting point for the marriage that ring was supposed to represent in the first place. And the next time someone mentions 2 months' salary, like it's an actual rule, remember, it was written by one copywriter for one company to solve one specific sales problem. And it worked so well you almost believed it was history. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, did you know the 2-month salary rule was invented, or did you find out just now? I'll see you in the next one.